Hello, I'm Pastor Hilly. Thank you for joining us for Faith Lutheran Church's Adult Forum series. We're calling this episode COVID, Cures, and Confusion. But before we get to our special guest this week, a brief reminder that during this time of social distancing, there is wonderful ministry coming out of the community that we call Faith Lutheran Church, right here in Whitehall, Ohio. Ministry that includes this very podcast. If you would like to support the ministry of faith financially, please find the link labeled Giving in the description below. And now, on to our episode. My special guest today is a good friend of mine, a guy from right here in the Columbus area. My good friend, Geoff Shafer. Jeff, thanks so much for coming out and being here at Faith and being part of this.
Thanks for having me, Pastor Hilly. I appreciate it. Glad to be here.
So one of the reasons that I asked you to be part of this, because you and I were kind of talking about like COVID and just things in the world, and your background is in an entirely different wheelhouse than my background is. You have that kind of like hard science, scientist brain, professional scientist researcher, that kind of thing. And I'm hoping that in our conversation, you can kind of shed light on just a lot of things that I don't understand about COVID and what's being said about cures or vaccines or timelines or that sort of thing. But I think it would be really helpful for anybody listening or watching. Could you start off by just giving us a little bio on yourself, a little background, and like what is it that you have done and that sort of thing?
Sure. I have my undergraduate degree in chemistry and psychology, and I've been involved in neuroscience research since I was a junior or a third-year student at Case Western Reserve in Cleveland, which is about 2003. And I have generally worked as a research assistant or as a lab manager. I've also worked in private industry in device consulting, sales and installation for specific research instruments that are mostly used in basic science research, which is what my background is. I also have my master's degree in physiology and biophysics, and I've done some work associated with physiological concepts as they relate to I guess you could say a neuroscience question, be it learning and memory, pattern generation in the brainstem that provides autonomic controls such as with breathing or heart rate control, and individual cellular cluster interaction that maintains our physiology the way that we don't really notice on a daily basis. You know, the kind of things that we don't pay too much attention to, like breathing or swallowing or our heart going up when we're exercising or going down when we're sleeping. And so that's kind of what my background has been. And because some of your viewers might not know, a basic researcher is someone who is working on a question, usually supported by a government grant of some type, that doesn't have a specific profit motive behind it, which means we're trying to find out a mechanism behind something, not necessarily cure an individual disease or come up with a gadget that we can then sell. So basic research is more of an investigation into the patterns behind the way that things work. Although I think it's valuable, at the same time, it's mostly a sunk cost. We don't really make money, and we're reliant on public funding.
That's interesting. You know, as you were talking, I thought about a dear friend of mine from my first congregation, a matriarch of the congregation, Ann Eberhard. And Ann and I were talking, and she once said to me that the difference between the hard sciences and kind of like, let's say, liberal arts education, she goes, hard sciences are a lot more like baking. It is exactly what it is, and you have to hit those. You have to hit everything to the nth degree to end up with the same product. Very much scientific method. Whereas like from a like, you know, kind of what I do, she would say, you do more cooking. Like you have a basic idea, doesn't really matter. You can throw a bunch of stuff around and you kind of come out on the back end. Which I always thought was just an amazing kind of metaphor for like the differences between hard science education and liberal arts education. But it also keeps me very humble and thankful for friends like yourself who exist in this really different world, because we approach life and we approach problem solving intrinsically different as people, right? Because my ideas are always like, let me pick things that don't make sense and don't exist and figure out how to like bring them into reality, which is not kind of your approach. It's let's identify what's there and work this through, which again is really cool, man. And again, thank you so much for just being here today and being part of this. So that all being said, socially distant life.
Yeah,
how's it treating you?
It has been challenging to an extent. I've personally had the luxury of being able to be with family. I actually had been living outside of Columbus for a time. I moved back when my father took ill last winter, and so I've been living with family since then. And so my situation has been fairly good and stable, but I know that a lot of people have encountered a number of challenges that were very unexpected.
Yeah.
This is not the type of thing where we normally prepare for, a pandemic
right.
to strike, and what could happen to people's employment, what could happen to people's social lives, what could happen to not being able to see family, including family that is gravely ill, which can be a very difficult situation. So I can't be too frustrated because I've been lucky, but I do think that this time has given us an opportunity to question ourselves and our values, and in some cases start looking at our own mortality in a way that, although bothersome at this time, disturbing almost, probably is rewarding if we allow ourselves to attempt to learn from it. I think that, and this is not political, but people have made a certain number of mistakes or a certain number of errors, many of which are forgivable. I mean, everything's forgivable. Mostly forgivable because people, were mostly not purposeful bad actors.
Right.
But I think that we should treat this as a learning experience and try to do better in the future. But it's been strange, a strange experience that I was not prepared for.
No, I don't think any of us were, right? And nothing ever happens in a vacuum either, right?
Yes.
And you kind of identified this, right? So there's not only the pandemic at hand and like the fear of health and safety, but the psychological clapback of everybody's social circles have dissipated. Like my family's in North Carolina. My parents are in a retirement community. My brother texted me a few days ago and was like, don't come home, because if I drive down, I can't see anybody anyway, right? And so not only is there the pandemic to worry about, not only is there COVID in and of itself, but there's all those domino effects from job security to psychological security to mental health issues.
Oh, definitely.
I did a conversation the other day with a guy who's an addict, and he talks about that regularly. And he goes, it's been really hard. He goes, I haven't been able to do an in-person AA meeting in months. And to think about even that as part of that reality of the cascading effect of social distancing and how all that engages. It is a world shaping or a world reshaping. Kind of reality that we're all just kind of blindly stumbling through right now. Yeah.
If I can ask, is your friend who hasn't been able to go to those AA meetings, have they explored virtual AA meetings? Are they working? Okay, great.
Yeah.
Great.
And like everybody else, thankfully, a lot of things in the addict world and in the mental health fields, have responded very quickly to still provide those services and still make that connection.
Good. That's good.
Yeah. All right. So here we are. And so let's start with this question.
Yeah.
What we call COVID has the full name, and I'm going to look at my cheat notes here, which are ample for our conversation. On my cheat notes, what we call COVID has the full name of SARS-CoV-2. It is a coronavirus that was first identified in 2019, hence the shorthand name, COVID-19. Am I somewhere in the ballpark here? Is that accurate information?
Yes, you are, Pastor Haley.
Right,
that's correct. researchers don't always have the most imaginative view in terms of naming things. They tend to orient toward making abbreviations that are very literal and contain as much information in as little space as possible. Think NASA, although sometimes I think NASA is kind of ridiculous with some of their acronyms. But I mean, basically, COVID-19 tells a virologist or a scientist working in the field that this is a coronavirus with an ID number of 2019.
Okay.
Like, so co is coronavirus is V, and I did I actually downloaded the CDC's own words, which, if you don't mind, I'll just read this verbatim.
Please.
On February 11th, 2020, the World Health Organization, the WHO, announced an official name for the disease that is causing the novel coronavirus outbreak, and I can explain what novel coronavirus is in a second. First identified in Wuhan, China. The name of this disease is coronavirus disease 2019, abbreviated as COVID-19. So the CO stands for corona, VI for virus, and D for disease. I was wrong about the ID thing. Okay. But it was formerly referred to as a much longer name that has to do with the type of proteins that are observed, and I'll be honest, I don't even know what that is.
Okay.
It's not important. It's more. I'm actually not a virologist. I know enough, hopefully, to be helpful and not too much of a danger to myself. But the actual long name, as it refers to protein identifiers on the outside and what the envelope of the virus looks like, is not really important to anybody except a virologist.
Okay.
So, yeah.
And when we look at the world in broad strokes, there's nothing new per se about coronaviruses, right? Like like what coronaviruses, as I understand it, were actually first identified back in the 1960s. MERS is a coronavirus. SARS is a coronavirus.
Yes. The common cold.
The common cold is a coronavirus.
Yes.
So what is it about COVID-19 that has blown it out of proportion into this worldwide pandemic?
So, just to kind of go on to what you asked about the coronavirus itself, because I didn't mention this before. It's called a coronavirus because it looks like a crown, and corona is Latin for crown. Oh. And it looks like a crown, not in the pictures that you see, because the pictures that you may see or the animations you see are a sphere, and it is spherical. But generally, viruses are not imaged as a sphere because they are so small. So they are imaged by a device called a transmission electron microscope, which requires a very thin section be sliced of tissue or material. And when you slice a sphere in half, you get a circle. And on the outside, there are little protein protuberances. That is actually how it binds and signals your cell to take it in so that it can infect you. And that makes it look like a crown. That is the, like I said, not terribly imaginative, pretty literal. Yeah. But coronaviruses, since transmission electron microscopy has been around since shortly after the Second World War, they started to identify a lot of viruses around that time, because before that time, a light microscope is not sufficient to give you any identifying information about the virus. You have to use the resolving power of an electron microscope, and that's where it got its name. What is interesting about coronaviruses is that they are generally, with a couple of specific exceptions, not pervasive in. They're pervasive on planet Earth, but they're not pervasive in infecting human beings. Yes, the common cold is a type of coronavirus. So is SARS, so is MERS, and so is COVID-19. But in general, most of the viruses that make us sick are not coronaviruses. Okay. Coronaviruses are generally more active in non-primate animals. Why is that? I actually don't know the reason.
Okay.
I am not sure. Again, I'm not a virologist. I know that is one of the contributing reasons why many of the viruses that are similar to, that are in the SARS subset, which includes SARS, MERS, and COVID, are zoonotic in origin, which means they come from an animal originally. So patient 0 is a person who had some type of infection brought by an animal.
Okay.
And that does appear to be what occurred here. Again, there are conflicting reports of whether it was a bat, whether it was at a meat market or what's called a wet market in Wuhan. I don't really know.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, some of the information that we have gotten out of China is uncertain.
Right.
At best. And so that has made things difficult. Okay, so with a little bit of background about coronavirus, what is making this so difficult for us? Well, I would say there are a couple things. I basically think that there are a number of sociological and political factors that have greatly exacerbated this problem. Now, I believe the disease in and of itself is dangerous. However, in comparison to the disease SARS is far more deadly. However, it infects far fewer people.
Really?
Basically because it never became airborne.
Oh.
It required direct mucous membrane transmission, which means you could really only get it from essentially oral. And it doesn't necessarily mean contact. It means that you would have to sneeze, the disease would be in your sputum, and that would then go into another person's mucous membranes and infect them directly, or by consuming flesh, uncooked or undercooked flesh of an animal that had the disease.
Right.
So SARS seems to never have gotten into the airborne realm, I guess you could say.
Okay.
And so because of that, it infected far fewer people, but its fatality rate was around 11%.
Oh, really?
Which was, that's bad.
Yeah.
Now, and that is far worse than coronavirus. Coronavirus does seem to be, I'm not trying to say it's safe by any means, and I think the best thing we can do is to take precautions, but its transmission rate is a bit unusual in that it's extremely virulent for coronavirus, which is a bit unusual. It appears to be mutating rapidly from a very slow spread that was mucus or sputum based to truly airborne, which is very small aerosolized droplets. It seems to remain active on surfaces. We originally thought 3 days. It seems to actually be more like 6 or 7 days. And these are things that are a bit odd.
Yeah.
I do not have an explanation for them, but those combined with the aforementioned, I think, political and sociological factors have made this situation to be of epidemic proportions. And when I say politics, I'm not talking about American politics. I'm just talking about when this emerged, going on to back to China. China did not do a very good job of talking about the disease, sharing any information with anybody else, and being open about what they were doing to stop it. They did make attempts to stop it. In fact, they very aggressively quarantined. However, they also suppressed information. And that meant that people did not know they were going to China and they were bringing infection into Europe, or they were bringing an infection back to the United States. Or they came from China, they were there over the holidays, and they came back to the U.S. to go back to school, and they had no idea they were infected. Many of these people were never even symptomatic.
Right.
And the thing is that those people were not told, hey, we should probably stop this. We should probably stop the movement of people in order to secure this because of what we've been. And there is evidence that certain, essentially the CDC version in China, were aware that this was very dangerous, and they urged people to be careful. And politicians said no because they thought it was embarrassing. That I believe did make some things more difficult and probably exacerbated this.
So when you were, to tie that into an earlier comment you made, when you were talking about the name of coronavirus or this specific one and kind of parsing what COVID-19 means, you used the word novel coronavirus as an adjective to...
Yeah.
Does that kind of point to that reality that you were talking about, that coronaviruses typically come from animals, like transmit in one way, but this one is doing something really new, right? A novel coronavirus would be a new kind of adaptation of that, right?
You are correct.
Okay.
And that this was, it both means, I believe the original term novel meant that it was a previously undefined type of coronavirus.
Okay.
Or a SARS-related coronavirus, which is SARS stands for severe acute respiratory syndrome, which means it's a virus that preferentially affects mucous membranes and cells related to the respiratory tract, which is why most people that encounter severe illnesses encounter that in their lungs or respiratory tract.
Yep.
And that ultimately causes some of the pathologies that we see. Originally novel just meant it was something we hadn't seen before, but it also means that it is unusual.
Okay.
You are correct.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that, because I think it would be easy for some people to say, oh, well, it's just like SARS, it's just like the common cold. But in that reality, like having that extra word, be like, no, this is a very new version of this that we haven't engaged with before. Like you were saying, they said, oh, if you get your mail, leave your mail outside for 2 days and then bring it in. And then the more we learn, the more things change. It's like, actually, it's more like 6, because we are kind of exploring this new reality.
Indeed. And a lot of I know that people are again, for a variety of reasons, experiencing frustration, which I do understand, as well as quarantine fatigue, which is also very understandable. But at the same time, I would hope that people would also try to be patient in that scientists and people within the government apparatus that are apolitical, that are more interested in trying to do their best to find a solution to this and to try to find a vaccine and what we can do to help people, don't have all the answers because this is brand new. This isn't something that has been fleshed out. This is not polio. We would pretty much know how to get to it.
So like a good conversational talking point is for people who are in conversations at the gas pump or within their own families, whenever I almost want to encourage people, if somebody goes, oh, well, it's COVID-19, it's just like, just stop people there and be like, it's actually not just like anything. I mean, it is this kind of different reality. And therefore, like, resting on any of those previous laurels isn't going to get us where we need to go culturally, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
And a lot of assumptions that folks made based on what had occurred in the past, that it would die out in the summer, and that the second wave in the winter would be greatly reduced. They were wrong. Yeah. And I don't think they were wrong because they're fools. Right. They were just wrong because they did their best to take an educated guess on the information they had based on their previous experience. And it wasn't the same.
I remember hearing an NPR story, and it was probably in April or whatnot, and they go, oh, once summer gets here, it'll get hot, and when it gets hot outside, it's like the flu, and it'll go away. And then one of the people in the NPR article said, if that was the case, they would not have COVID-19 in Brazil. Right? Because southern hemisphere, hotter environment, all that kind of thing. Yes. And at that point in time, Sao Paulo was on fire, like, to use a phrase, right?
Yes.
So I think that's a really just good point that should be underlined, is that it is a new reality in so many ways. And so we're all kind of stumbling through this together.
Yes.
So here we are. Here we are amid a pandemic, and there's a lot in the news right now, wherever you get your news from, it doesn't really matter, but there's a lot in the news right now about vaccines or cures and the current availability, future availability, all that sort of thing. I think first and foremost, what I want to ask someone with your background is, how would you define the words vaccine and cure? Are they synonyms? Are they different definitions? Do you use them differently in kind of like your spheres of reality?
Yes, I consider them to be different, and that they do mean different things. I know that in the public sphere, they're probably thought of as being synonymous, and the reason I say they're not is because a vaccine is not a cure. It is an inoculation, and an inoculation is by definition a prophylactic measure, something that is being done to prevent a disease. For example, I'll go back to saying, polio again, or the MMR vaccine that we give our kids, measles, mumps, rubella, are things that are given so that they do not get these diseases. if an individual presents with polio, which is very rare, but you vaccinate them, that doesn't really serve a purpose at that point. Because they have already been infected. And so that's the reason I say it is not a cure, because a cure is a term that I generally define as being a treatment plan that leads to a successful recovery or the prevention of a relapse in someone who has already been infected.
So that's a key difference, right?
Yes.
Like you're saying, one is preventative and the other is reactive. I mean, in broad strokes here.
In broad strokes,
Yeah.
and I'm sure that there are probably some people that would, break that apart semantically, and that's fine.
Yeah.
I'm not an infectious disease expert. I do know some things I think are valuable about it, but in terms of the semantics, the reason I consider them being different is what I explained, and so that people understand that. Getting an infection, for example, and then getting the vaccination is not useful. The goal is to be vaccinated when you have never had the disease. If you get the disease, if you're infected by the virus and you survive, your body will have been able to successfully, with varying degrees of success, fight off the virus.
Right.
And that is done by your body produces what are called antibodies that are kind of like a key, or I should say kind of like a lock. And they mate with a key that is on the virus, and both are protein identifiers. Imagine that one looks like this and one looks like this, and they go together perfectly.
Okay.
It takes a little bit of your time for your body to figure that out. Okay. And when that antibody locks on to the virus, it basically puts a big arrow on the virus that says, "Come destroy me."
Okay.
And lymphocytes, other parts of your immune system, or hunter-killer cells, find that virus and destroy it. What a virus does is help your body produce antibodies before an infection ever occurs.
Okay.
So instead of your body having to learn from the virus and produce antibodies all by itself, I essentially will tell your body after an inoculation how to make the antibodies, and it'll be ready to go as soon as it sees that virus.
Yeah.
So in all honesty, this is not a great example because polio is essentially, and smallpox have essentially been eradicated. But imagine something like measles, where many of us have the measles virus circulating in our bodies. It just can't do anything.
Yeah.
Or some of us have tuberculosis, or in fact, a lot of us have tuberculosis, but it doesn't really do anything because we've been inoculated, or we have received hepatitis B vaccine, or I for older people like me, that is people in their mid-30s and older, they probably had chickenpox.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Younger people, even 5 to 10 years younger than me, didn't because they were inoculated. I produced those antibodies because I had the disease. They never had to because they received the vaccine. And so the power of a vaccine is in its prophylactic measure to prevent a disease, not necessarily cure it, which means that until you can be successfully inoculated, you need to remain as vigilant.
Yeah.
We can't permit ourselves to just assume that safety is coming and we can just do whatever.
No, exactly. And so the things that help our bodies create antibodies on like a daily level, right? Because our bodies are always kind of
correct,
right, creating antibodies as we engage with things, right? Which is, and we were talking about this off camera a little bit ago. I always make the joke, the problem is that there's too much Purell in the world, right? Like if as kids we all ate dirt and played outside and rolled around in the manure, we'd all be fine, which again is like obviously not true, but is founded in some truth because as we interact with different things in our environments, it kind of gets our body used to these different things.
Yes.
But again, that being said, like, and you made the point, that's one of those things that's not true, but it's definitely not false. It has root in truth, but it's very much not true. Because
True.
if our, because it's kind of the herd immunity argument, right? Just give everybody the disease and like let the chips fall where they are, which is just heartless, kind of on the front end from like a moral perspective.
I agree.
That's absolutely heartless. And so, as we're trying to again understand this new version of the coronavirus, again it's staying safe prior to vaccination, getting a vaccination, and then staying safe after vaccination by social distancing and washing hands and using hand sanitizer and doing all of these things to make sure that we're not introducing that virus to our body, because that would require the development of a cure,
Yes.
which is different than a vaccine, which is kind of like a long way back around to that point.
Correct.
Yeah.
And some things that we've seen from various pharmaceutical companies, for example, the antibody treatment that was given to President Trump when he was ill was developed by a company called Regeneron, and that antibody treatment is more of a cure than a vaccine. It is used to treat people who have the disease. It has shown quite a bit of success. It's not universal.
Right.
It does seem to have worked for him, and it has worked for others.
Yeah.
That is not a vaccine. Now, has he developed antibodies at this point? Almost certainly, yes.
Right.
So he would be an individual who would not need the vaccine necessarily because he's already produced the antibodies. He'll probably still get it, and in most cases, even for people who've been infected, it would be recommended they receive the vaccine anyway, just to be sure, because it is possible to have an illness, develop the antibody response, and then to lose it. It's also possible to be vaccinated, develop the antibody response, and lose it. Those are things, which is one of the reasons we have booster shots.
Yeah.
I do not know whether we will need booster shots with this vaccine or not. I don't know.
Well, even if we just talk about the vaccine and how it's being developed, because there are a number of companies, and we'll get into that a little bit, but can you give us any insights into the timeline? Typically, when a vaccine is being developed, does the COVID vaccine seem to be taking longer than you might expect, or does it feel like an appropriate time? Because as somebody who doesn't have that background, I'm like, it'll get here when it gets here, right? But like, do you think it's taking longer than it should or shorter? And I realize that that's a really complex question when we're talking scientific research, B, FDA, all that kind of stuff.
I know it doesn't feel fast, but I actually think that we've made incredible progress at an incredible speed. So going back to coronaviruses, and I do have to warn you, this is an incomplete answer.
Okay.
But coronaviruses are hard to make vaccines for. Why? It has to do with the structure of the envelope, which is what surrounds the genetic material inside of the virus. So what a virus is, just a little bit of background. I don't want to get too sciencey, so please stop me. but basically, a virus is not really a life form. It is more of a protein construct. And what is on the inside of the virus is a segment of material that can bind to your DNA and essentially order it to do things that are not in its best interest. So what a virus does is it usually has something on the outside that signals to the cell, I am your friend. And the cell says, oh, okay, come join the party inside the cell. And then the virus is in there, surreptitiously sneaks out its DNA material that goes into the nucleus of the cell, which is kind of the cell's control center, and it incorporates itself into that cell's genetic code. And that genetic code is present in every cell in your body. Well, almost every cell in your body, not erythrocytes, but that's... anyway, and so it doesn't... And so it starts to order your cell to do stuff essentially at its own stuff that your cell wouldn't normally do.
Right.
And your cell basically is receiving instructions to start producing more viruses to the point where the viruses then explode out of your cell and your cell dies. And the goal of a virus is not nefarious. The goal of a virus is to make more viruses. That's it. Right. And so it doesn't say I want to go and attack the respiratory system because that's how that's fun and exciting or anything. Right. It's essentially I want to make more of these viruses, and my machinery tells me that it works especially well in these particular type of cells, which means it destroys those cells, and that causes the pathology.
Okay. Because it's just trying to like multiply itself.
Correct. It's literally trying to survive.
Yeah. And then it's just that the back end of its survival is our not survival.
Yes.
Correct. No, I get that.
And so, because of the nature of this mechanism and the way that the coronavirus goes about binding to a cell, telling the cell its friend, going into the cell, injecting the DNA material, and reordering the machinery, because of the way that works, coronaviruses are especially difficult to make vaccines for. What is the actual reason for that? I'm not real sure. And I know that because of that, that's one of the reasons why making vaccines against SARS and MERS or a lot of the common cold has been very challenging, and still is kind of wishy-washy. I mean, SARS kind of went away, and it was limited by that mucus transmission process that I mentioned earlier. But and there are vaccines. They are kind of mediocre, frankly, as I understand it. I mean, I haven't had SARS, but as I understand it. And so I think that the work that has been done has actually been pretty outstanding. And I think that that's something to be proud of, that groups rose to the occasion to be able to do this. And I have to say, although I have thoughts about Pfizer, they did this work pretty much on their own without government funding. And I admit I'm quite surprised. I would have thought that the injection of government funds would have been required to develop this. But I think that their timeline has been reasonable. I think that getting this essentially a vaccine that is 95% effective in about a year since it was first noticed in Wuhan is pretty darn good.
Yeah.
I think that we still have some challenges ahead of us, which is the vaccine is fragile, and it's not going to be easy to produce in hundreds of, honestly, billions of dose quantity. Right. That's obviously more of a logistics issue, especially because it has to be kept so cold. Usually it has to be kept below minus 70 Celsius. Oh, wow. So that's approaching the coldest temperature on Earth and some of the coldest refrigerators that we normally use in science. And so those are some specific challenges there. Does that answer your question?
No, absolutely. Okay. No, it's good.
Okay.
So you just mentioned Pfizer, and I have to ask because I don't know the difference. Is there a difference between like pharma or the pharmaceutical industry and like scientific researchers, or is there a Venn diagram overlap between the two? Is there like a Hatfield McCoy rivalry between the two? Like.
So they are definitely different. Let's take, for example, somebody most people are probably familiar with, Dr. Anthony Fauci. Mm-hmm. He is a basic science researcher. His background has been in infectious diseases, and he runs several laboratories at the NIH that are responsible for researching the background of that disease, or the several diseases that he researched, which are actually not coronaviruses, and attempting to find both cures and the mechanism behind its actions so that a vaccine can be developed. Okay. In general, basic researchers, of which I am one, don't invent vaccines. They have in the past, but generally speaking, they partner with a pharmaceutical company to work on making the vaccine because, well, why? The reason being, a basic researcher is interested in how something works, kind of not making an engine, they're interested in knowing why the engine does what it does. So what is the role of a piston? What does a carburetor do? The crankshaft and the transmission of power through the transmission. What are all of these things, and how do they work? If we understand how it works, we can then deconstruct it and then redo it so that it's better, or perhaps find ways to improve it, stop it doing something, just like that. They also don't have the ability to mass produce things. So if I know a lot about a Ford engine and am able to improve it greatly, that is not the same as I can now build Ford engines. I need to build a $1 billion plant that can make engines because it is an extremely complicated process. So is making a vaccine, and so is making drugs. So a basic researcher might partner with a drug company. However, there are many both financial and ethical reasons why they have to be generally separate.
Okay.
Because public money, essentially which is what most basic researchers are funded off of, being used to support a for-profit entity would be considered not in the interest of taxpayers. That doesn't mean it doesn't happen; it does. But at the same time, and we have to be very careful with that. And if a basic researcher consults or works with a for-profit company, in the scientific community, they have to disclose what those relationships are, because if they were to offer an opinion, a professional opinion on that subject, they could be biased because they have a vested interest in it. For example, if I was a professor at my alma mater, Case Western Reserve in Cleveland, and I worked for Eli Lilly in Indianapolis, and I reviewed a paper that presented information that was not in Eli Lilly's best interest, and they found out about that, that would be considered unethical because I was using a personal bias to torpedo a competitor, and wasn't necessarily basing my opinion on its scientific merit.
Okay.
So because of the confusion there, in general, they are separate entities, and there is good reason behind that. However, yes, basic scientists do consult with pharmaceutical companies, and although this is a biased answer, I have my own biases. A lot of the work that pharmaceutical companies use, not necessarily coronavirus, but they use basic research that is available for free, and they don't have to pay for that because it's public, and they utilize that to then make money. That is a more complicated question that we're probably not here to answer today. That's more of a policy and ethics question. But those are the primary differences, and one of the reasons why, for example, Dr. Anthony Fauci is somebody who wants to champion a vaccine, but he is actually more interested in giving information to people who might be able to make the vaccine about how to do that more effectively and more quickly, and also making policy.
Oh, okay.
Apolitical, not Republican, Democrat, or any, about how we can help people that have the disease and help people prevent getting the disease. And generally, that is what our public officials are there for, is to offer us protection, not necessarily to sell us a cure. That's the role of a private company.
So when you look at the relationship between researchers and pharma, and how does that dance happen? Let's say specifically with testing and clinical trials. Like, which side does that happen on? Is the clinical trial, is the testing that Venn diagram middle ground where they kind of meet, where they kind of dance together? Like, how does that all work?
To an extent, you're correct.
Okay.
They can do that. They can also run trials completely on their own.
Either side of that can?
No. Generally speaking, basic researchers don't do clinical trials.
Okay.
There are exceptions. It is extremely rare for a basic research. a single lab to make a vaccine.
Mm-hmm.
It has occurred,
Mm-hmm.
but usually it is a large group of people working together to do it, and that's because it is hard.
Yeah.
Why is it hard? It's very complicated, very specific, and a lot of it is trial and error.
Right.
Unfortunately, we don't have the scientific knowledge to say, this is the molecule we need to make to fix this. This is the machine we can use to actually make this molecule, and then we'll just punch it in and make this molecule like a 3D printer.
Right.
Although that has been discussed in theory, we don't have that technology.
Right.
And so we have to do a lot of chemistry that requires high throughput screening, which is essentially throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks.
Right.
And that's very time consuming and requires a lot of personal labor and requires a lot of money, because usually that personal labor is extremely skilled.
Yeah.
So generally speaking, pharmaceutical interests pay for the study process.
Okay.
Sometimes the government pays for the study process. Sometimes a nonprofit organization like the March of Dimes with polio pays for the process.
Yeah.
And I happen to like that a lot, but that has only occurred a couple times.
Right.
Usually it's a pharmaceutical company, because if they pay for it and they own the patents on it, then they completely control its distribution over a period of time. And that can be extremely profitable.
I was about to say, yeah. That's just capitalism at its best, right?
Yes, yeah,
or worst, or the worst.
Yes, I mean, I don't think that. That's another complicated thing to talk about, but I mean, I don't think that they're all evil.
No.
I think that the profit motive plays a role in motivating people to do things, and clinical trials cost hundreds of millions of dollars.
Right.
Because you have to get the group of people. A lot of these people, they are asked exhaustive questions about their background, where they are. They may be asked to quarantine themselves. They have to be paid. Ethically, they have to be paid.
Yep.
And so a lot of that, basic researchers and nonprofit, both universities and government entities or government organizations supported by government entities, don't really want to spend that kind of money, and really don't have that kind of money to spend. In terms of the actual role that a researcher might play in a clinical trial, however, researchers can participate in making part of the vaccine or part of what is being used in the clinical trial that they originally developed, and they may be asked to participate in analyzing some of the results. For example, although this is not universal, and I'm not saying this is what Pfizer or Moderna are doing, because I don't know, but a publicly funded laboratory might be asked to analyze a participant's blood to see what the antibody numbers are in that bloodstream, or to try an experimental chemical in animals first. And that is probably where the biggest contribution of a basic lab would be, is before it even gets to a human being, making sure that it's safe.
Okay.
Because if I develop a cure or a vaccine that works for 50% of people, and the other 50% it kills.
Yeah.
That's not okay.
No.
and so we don't want the first injection to be in a human being. We want that to be in an animal.
Right.
So that if there is a problem, then we will stop right there and not even proceed.
Right.
That is where basic researchers tend to be more involved.
Okay.
Now, these are generalizations.
Right.
My knowledge about Pfizer is that they have done everything themselves, which for a company that large is possible.
Nice.
But a lot of the group that they were working with in Germany, BioNTech, is a slightly smaller company, and they probably relied on university research for some of the efficacy studies and safety studies early on.
Right. Which, I mean, speaking of Pfizer and BioNTech specifically, so the basic researchers start by kind of doing the groundwork. Then there's this kind of a Venn diagram overlap that you were just kind of talking about in the clinical trials, as we try to figure out how these vaccines work and all that sort of thing before we release them to the market, right? Which is the last step in that process. What does that last step in that process look like from vaccine trial candidates to mass distribution? Like, what does that kind of last step look like? And I mean, you've already pointed out that when we're talking about COVID-19, the vaccine needs to be kept at like certain temperatures and all that, which is a logistic question on the way back end of literally how do you mail it out to people. But can you just kind of like quickly walk me from, if you are in that pharma side of things, how do you get from 95% efficacy of the vaccine to actually putting it on the truck and sending it out?
Okay. So the logistics step may be one of the most challenging. Mm-hmm. That is also the last step. The steps that come before that, after efficacy, after we show that it works, mm-hmm. is verification and approval. And verification means, yes, it works at 95%. Verification is we can actually produce this in large quantities. Mm-hmm. We can make sure that it is the same. In other words, there isn't a weird difference batch to batch.
Oh, yeah.
And that it interacts with all different types of people about the same, which might mean a slightly larger group that is kind of, that larger group testing is going to be occurring either just before or at the same time you submit the paperwork to the Federal Drug Administration for final approval. And often that whole process can take a very, very long time, months. Mm-hmm. In a case like this, the FDA is probably going to almost literally stop what they're doing.
And make this top priority?
Yes. And so this could probably be done fairly quickly. How quickly? I don't know, but probably within weeks, because they will, in theory, stop everything and go right to do this. And they will look at all the data, they will look at the efficacy, they will verify the statistics that are presented by them. The statistics have to be presented by both Pfizer as well as a third party, which could be those basic science researchers.
Yep. Okay.
People who have a non-vested interest in it. Mm-hmm. In other words, if Pfizer says everything is good, of course they would, right? And I'm not trying to say it is not, but I'm trying to say that we have to get a third party to verify that what they are saying is correct, and that every part of what they're saying is correct. Mm-hmm. Which is why, just as a fun fact, if you use supplements, for example, you take fish oil, you can't say it's a cure for anything because it shows some effect to do something, and that effect has been substantiated with research, but it's still not, this cures heart disease.
Right.
You can't say that.
Okay.
Because the efficacy has not been there. So all of the paperwork that is done in the FDA bureaucracy is there to ensure the public that everything that the producing entity is saying is correct, that it does what it says it does, it does it for the number of people or the percentage that it says it does, in the way, mechanically the way it says it does.
Okay.
And by the last step, so along with approval, is testing that large group, and then you get approval, and then it is considered good to go.
Oh, wow.
And usually, even before you get final approval, you start to ramp up production.
Okay.
Because that takes a while.
Yeah.
Now, I am being general. I am talking about a situation where speed matters, where you want to get going, and money is really not a, if this is what we call an orphan drug, which is something that is used to treat an extremely rare disease, you would go slower because there's not a lot of profit in it. For something like this, there is both profit in it and the government willing to throw money at you.
Yeah.
So you're ready to accelerate, and then the last step after approval is the logistics.
Yeah.
That is probably going to be the most challenging for the Pfizer and Moderna treatment because they require such low temperatures. But I believe they know that and they're working on that already. Nice. But it's still going to. So I would like to say to people reviewing this that it will take months.
Yeah.
And for people who are less vulnerable, that is, not elderly, not immunocompromised, not having other pre-existing conditions that greatly increase their risk of a coexisting or a comorbidity that greatly increases their risk of a bad outcome.
Right.
beyond those people, I would say you need to plan on 3 to 4 months before inoculations are available, and then at least 3 to 6 months after that for inoculations to be universal enough that precautions can be lifted. Oh, wow. And I tend to be fairly conservative there because I don't want us to make a mistake. Right. So it might be faster. I hope it is, but no, I would say 9 to 10 months.
Okay. All right. So as we're talking about vaccines and kind of that process from understanding what the disease is, the coronavirus in this case, understanding the virus to logistics is a whole process. I feel like we've done a pretty good job of kind of touching on those stages. And I think it's also in this time of pandemic and more than a little bit of hysteria over the last couple months as it's kind of involved with the COVID reality, what's happening, what's not happening. Mm-hmm. I think it's a really good thing to let the general populace know that companies like Pfizer and Moderna and BioNTech are working on these things. But I'm also a little worried that as the populace hears, there could be a vaccine in 3 months, but then distribution maybe 6 months, 9 months after that, may hear that and go, all right, cool, I don't have to worry about anything. Vaccine's on its way. Like, I'm fine. And I get really nervous about that because every time I turn on the news, wherever I get the news from, it's like, they're working on a vaccine. And I've heard people make comments like that. We're like, vaccine's coming. No more mask. Why are we going into lockdown? Why is there a curfew? There's a vaccine. Let's not worry about it. And again, I just feel like that's going to get us in a really bad place. Right? Like, if we, because as you're saying, like, it's our job to be vigilant, then get vaccinated, and then remain vigilant. So if we go in, if we go into a vaccine season, for lack of a better phrase, and everybody, and cases...
I like that. A vaccine season. I actually think that's a very good idea.
Yeah. But the 6 weeks leading up to the availability of the vaccine, everybody stops social distancing, stops washing their hands, and stops following all these protocols, then we're going to have a huge spike in cases, which is a cure issue more than a vaccine issue. Mm-hmm. And again, it just puts us in in this very chaotic kind of reality, right? I mean, do you think that there's psychologically speaking a fear of a kind of a cultural clapback due to the fact that so much of the news is covering, so many pharma companies are working so hard and working so fast to get this out?
Mm-hmm. A clapback meaning people who say, I guess I will soon be safe and I can just relax so that we... and I think that I have to say as a researcher, trying to be dispassionate about the whole concept that could potentially be dangerous, and that is we have to go back to thinking of a vaccine as, like I said, a prophylactic measure, a preventative measure, which means let's say in our thought experiment here that everybody is infected with coronavirus, is a vaccine useful at that point? The answer is not really. Mm-hmm. I mean, yes, it is still useful, but if you're infected and you survive, it's likely you've developed some antibodies, and that in some ways defeats the purpose of the vaccine. The vaccine is still useful because a vaccine tends to be able to deal with a number of different mutations of the virus. Okay. It's usually not single, and I admit I do not know the details about Pfizer or Moderna's vaccine to know whether it is active with a number of different mutations they've observed. But an example is when you get a flu vaccine every year, it changes, and that's because the nature of the individual flu virus is constantly changing. Mm-hmm. There are groups of people that are examining that change, and they are adjusting the formulation accordingly. Mm-hmm. So, yes, it would still have value, but a lot less value. Right. And so until the point where I would say between 50 to 65% of the population is inoculated, we shouldn't do anything differently.
Right. And the thing with that, too, is The numbers that I've heard is hypothetically 1 million doses of vaccine potentially by the end of the year, which 1 million people is approximately the Columbus metro area. And then from what I've heard is within by January, February, March, by March of 2021, maybe approximately 40 million doses. I mean, if the Pfizer thing kind of goes through, which 4 million people is Los Angeles, right? So that's 4 million people. And then the approximate American population is 331 million people.
Yes.
And so 4 million, 4 out of 331 is such a small percentage.
Yes.
So when we talk about inoculating 50 to 60% of 331 million people, like the development of the vaccine, the distribution of some of the vaccine, and actually getting to that point, we're probably talking way further down the line than 6 to 9 months.
That is likely.
Yeah.
And yes. And assuming for a minute, again, I do not know about the licensing that will occur, but and the reason I say licensing is let's pretend for a moment that Pfizer's vaccine is the best. I'm not saying it should be. I'm not saying it is. I'm just saying let's just pretend for a minute it is. Are they going to make all of it themselves? Unlikely, because like a little production, I don't say a little production facility, even a very large production facility making 300 million vaccines, and that's just the U.S. That's not the 5 billion vaccines that we need to inoculate the Earth. Is quite an undertaking.
Yeah.
And so they will likely license it to other people.
Yeah.
So that they can share the production responsibilities. And that does take time and will take time to ramp up. So I'm saying that even if 3 months from now everybody's going gangbusters, we will reach a wall where they just can't make more faster.
Right.
And I mean, when you're dealing with the hundreds of millions or billions of doses, you're getting into that type of economy of scale where even though there's a lot of money behind it, we just can't do anymore.
Right. And we're talking single doses, and that's not even to mention something you brought up earlier, which is booster shots, or what happens if there's variants on it as the disease continues to like adapt and that sort of thing.
Not if, when.
When,
Yeah,
right,
exactly.
right, yeah.
Yeah.
Pfizer, they're a Michigan company, aren't they? Isn't their headquarters in Michigan? I want to say they're like Western Michigan, which just makes me think, what is Michigan's greatest natural resource? Decommissioned automobile factories. Maybe there's an opportunity here to revitalize and like retrofit there.
That is possible.
It is. Like, this is outside of our areas of expertise, but I'm like, you got these huge buildings and conveyor belts.
I think the large building infrastructure may be useful. Not to get too much in the weeds, heavy industry and biotechnology are different enough that outside of the building, the uses might be limited.
I can see.
I'm not trying to be. I
get
it's
you.
just so pedantic, but it's kind of producing an engine or a piston is a little bit different than a clean room environment where you're producing a pure recombinant DNA technology or recombinant DNA produced drug, which is something I would just like to get in is for people who have heard the name recombinant DNA technology and they're frightened of it. You should understand this vaccine is produced using recombinant DNA technology. You should not be afraid of it.
What is recombinant DNA technology?
It basically means recombinant DNA technology is recombining strips of DNA for a purpose that you are choosing to make it for. In other words, it's an unnatural sequence.
Okay.
DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, is made up of a sequence of 4 different acids, 4 different chemicals that bind together to produce a code not dissimilar from the binary code that operates your computer system. It's a group of instructions.
Right.
And basically, it's very long and very detailed and has millions and millions of, trillions of base pairs. And basically, it orders your cell to do different things. And if you move those around in ways that are not natural to your body. That's called recombinant DNA
Oh, wow.
technology. There's nothing necessarily bad about it. It certainly could be used to do bad things, but
Okay.
there's no reason it would necessarily be used to do bad things. And I think that some public information that has been spread about recombinant DNA technology focuses on the bad things that could happen, as opposed to using this technology to produce an RNA sequence that can be used to go into your body, or that can be injected into your body to prompt your immune system to produce the antibodies necessary to isolate and lead to the destruction of the virus. I think that technology is very powerful.
Yeah.
And I hope that by many people partaking in it, it will kind of lead to less demonization of that technology
Right.
than we have sometimes seen. That's just kind of my own little aside there on that.
Yeah.
But I mean, biotechnology and the ability to resequence DNA for our own purposes is powerful. It does not need to be evil, and it can really do a lot of great things. It has been used here to some success. Previous vaccines, again, going back to polio, didn't really have that technology available to them, and so they did essentially something that was similar but using a less elegant method. It's still very effective, but it was just less exacting and less elegant than recombinant DNA technology permitted. That's one of the reasons it got done so quickly as well.
Oh, wow.
Is because this technology, being able to reorder strips of DNA to produce a specific sequence, is something that allowed us to move more quickly, as opposed to just having to toy with inactivated viruses, which is how vaccines have been made in the past.
Oh, wow. Nice.
Does that answer your question?
No, it does. It does.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, but especially in regard to how people are going to be looking forward to the holidays, I think that I would encourage people, even though they know the vaccine is coming and they're very excited about it, I would encourage them not to remain any less vigilant, because not to be overly fatalistic or to scare people exactly, but imagine a situation where you thought everything was going to be good in the future. You did spread the disease to people who were vulnerable, and they got sick.
Yep.
And that was a week before there was a vaccine was available. That would be pretty bad.
Yeah.
Especially since it is avoidable. We don't have to have large family get-togethers in person.
Right.
We want to. I
We
certainly
do.
want to see my 94-year-old grandmother. And I don't believe I have coronavirus. I haven't been tested recently, and so it's possible that I do. But even if everybody is tested, truly, unless everybody is tested like NASA tests astronauts before they go to a space station, where they are isolated in an environment where literally everything they touch has been sanitized. Everybody they interact with has been tested. They themselves are tested every 72 hours.
Oh, wow.
They are making sure that there is no possible way you're infected.
Right.
Unless you're doing that, there are risks, and I simply state that why take that risk? I mean, when we go to the grocery store, we take a risk.
Yep.
When people are getting, my grandmother food from the grocery store, there's a risk. It's a low risk.
Right.
So why increase that risk unnecessarily? Because we love because we want to be with our loved ones.
Right.
Which is understandable. At the same point in time, if somebody said, if you could wait this season and have a much better chance to be with your loved ones in a safe way, wouldn't you rather wait? I would encourage people to wait.
Yeah.
We canceled our Thanksgiving plans, which is unfortunate, but I think that's necessary. So I would, despite the fatigue that people are experiencing and light at the end of the tunnel, we are not at that light yet,
Right.
And we still have to continue being careful.
And I think that's one of the things, and we talked about this really early on, is not only is it coronavirus, but it's that domino of other effects, whether it's job security or the mental health, right? Like, no one wants to sign on to be uncomfortable or isolated indefinitely. Right. And indefinitely is what it feels like right now.
Yes.
You know, if we could tell all of America, all right, everybody, skip out on Thanksgiving, skip out on Christmas, and then we want everybody in America to have the biggest 4th of July party in the world. I think we could get people on board with that, right?
Sure. I mean, I like that idea.
Yeah, but sadly, we can't give that hard stop. You know, at this point, we just can't give that hard stop for all the reasons that we've talked about. Developing the vaccine, the logistics of getting the vaccine out in different waves, the reality of 331 million people in America, and all these sorts of things. And so, yeah, we're all living in this hurry up and wait kind of world. And we've been in hurry up and wait kind of world since March 13th, 15th. I mean, it was identified in February, but the shutdowns here were March 13th, 15th. It was 3 weeks. It was 3 weeks before Easter. It was 3 weeks before Easter, because I remember that happened. And I had to go out and buy a microphone and figure out, like, all right, how do I recreate a church environment online? Mm-hmm. And I was just in a conversation today with somebody who said, I just want to be back in church for Easter 2021. And I was like, my fingers are crossed. You know, I would love to be in church for Christmas 2020. Do I think that's a reality? Not at all. I just don't. But, you know, we can be hopeful. But hopefulness and realism, we have to kind of balance those things out together.
So the hope is extremely powerful, mm-hmm. and is something that even you know, scientists that operate on objective facts, even we benefit from hope, because it being able to believe that we can do something better is a driving force behind the reason we make the decisions that we make. I mean, if we felt no hope, then why even try it? I mean, it's so incredibly useful. At the same time, and I know this will sound harsh, hope doesn't necessarily save you.
Right. Oh, yeah.
Making wise choices may. And so I would encourage people to maintain hope, at the same time not relying on luck.
Right.
To prevent an illness, especially when taking some steps that admittedly are growing old and are frustrating us a lot, and are causing, you know, a lot of people to struggle mentally with the isolation and the frustration. That's, I'm not trying to say that is not damaging, because it is, but we all of those things have to be remembered in the context that we can still take steps to prevent this.
Right.
We can't prevent all of it, but we can greatly reduce it by making personal sacrifices. Yeah. And I think that choosing to make those personal sacrifices is kind of a way of transferring your hope to the people that actually need the hope more, by making sure that the people who are sick or are have been ill and have been debilitated by the virus, or are extremely vulnerable, they can hold on to that hope,
right?
Because you're making those sacrifices.
Or to think about, like, I mean, and as you just said, hope is a motivator. Hope is a companion. It's not necessarily a destination, right? Because you can get caught in this holding pattern of hope, where you just kind of don't do anything and wait, and that can feel really futile from time to time. But if hope is your motivator and wanting to take that next step, then that's what's going to change your behavior, which is this way of, like, transferring and helping out all those other people, right? Like, if we all just hope it gets better but don't do anything, then it's not going to get better. Like, it's that easy, right? But if we hope that it gets better and we all do what we can as individuals to socially distance and wash our hands, and again, to just be in as few risk activities or high risk activities.
Yes.
And anything that involves people is a risk activity. I mean, you being here in my office for this podcast, risk activity. You know, to keep everything as tethered to safety as we can. I think that is, hope is that place where we start from, and the thing that motivates us. Hoping for the best July 4th in American history. I still think that's the thing, man.
I think it's a great goal.
I do. Me too. Man. Well, Jeff, man, hey, I just want to thank you so much for coming by today, being part of our Adult Forum series. My good friend Jeff, everybody. Again, we appreciate it. Do you think, are there any resources that you think would be useful to put out for people? Like World Health Organization stuff, anything that I can put in the description below?
I think some of the guidelines that the CDC has put out, which are generally in accordance with WHO recommendations, we could put a link there.
Yep, absolutely.
I think that I could also send you a link to some of the information about the viruses.
Please do.
When I was reading about viruses more recently, some of it is press releasey, which is, not very. It's vague.
Man.
But it might be useful to people because we don't really know details about the virus, and we won't for a while, other than it's useful. And so these things you can read about. But I think most of those, the CDC, the Pfizer press releases, some information about the virus, some efficacy reports are all going to say the same thing, which is this is a great thing. This is something that is important that we treat as a goal moving toward. It is not immediate. It doesn't really affect our behavior right now and what we should be doing right now. I'm sure that also a lot of people are feeling lonely and isolated. There are a lot of online groups, and I don't mean therapy. I mean people getting together and chatting about things that are meaningful to them. Because if you can't go out to a restaurant or your favorite pub to chat about the world with people, although that might seem kind of, oh, well, whatever, it does wear on you.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And so, I think that people being able to share in some type of interpersonal interaction using FaceTime or Zoom or something like that, those are useful. And there are groups online that I might give you a link to put in the description below as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, and we'll put all that in the description below just so you guys have that available. Again, Geoff Shafer, thank you so much for your time and the conversation, and always a pleasure, my friend.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Pastor. Really appreciate it. Yeah.
Yes, sir.